back to our 11th house.
Welcome
Woohoo!
back.
We are here today to continue our house series with the beautiful fifth house, the house of pleasure and creativity. I love the fifth house.
hmm hmm It's a good house. Lots
Yes,
of good stuff in there.
it is. All right, we are July 15, 2024 at 11:18 a.m. I am in Whatcom County, Washington. So, fifth house. We're going to talk about what is fun for you, how you enjoy yourself, how you express yourself, where you find joy, all the good things. That's probably why we all love the fifth house.
hmm hmm
But to be fair, there is just like every other house. Just because we have a good house topic doesn't mean we can't have difficult things happening in those areas of our lives, depending on
Yeah.
placements and such. So let's start out with the good stuff. So, fun and pleasure are included in the fifth house. So, like I said, what makes you feel joy and excitement, um, and how you show off your playful and fun side can all show up in your fifth house sign and planets. Leo and the sun are the natural zodiac affiliation stuff with the fifth house. So, when we think of this correlation with Leo and the sun is kind of like where you find your vitality and life force and like what lights you up. And Leo can talk about that like playfulness. So, what does all that stuff look like when you're factoring in your placements of the fifth house? Fifth house can talk about just like simply living for today because the only way to really find joy is to be in the present moment. I come from a somewhat heavy mental health talking background. I used to talk about mental health. I am a believer that anxiety is when you're living too much in the future, like you're worrying about what's going to happen and stuff. And then depression shows up when you're living too much in the past and you're like
Mm.
living in this shame and regret and stuff. So to find joy would be simply just being in the present, like I have
hmm
everything I need right now type deal. So the fifth
hmm
house can talk about just this ability to be present and live for today and enjoy and make the most of what you have right now. And that shows up in children too, right? When kids are just like
hmm
having the time of their lives, oblivious of their surroundings, they're just doing their thing.
Yeah, I definitely feel like the depression is like living kind of like too much in the past, and then anxiety is like worrying too much about the future, right? So it's that finding that middle ground. And then because that's where you have creative hobbies and things like that, right? Which are things that can help you be in the present moment, like a little bit more to
Mm-hmm.
just focus on the thing that's like right in front of you. Because if you're really passionate about whatever the thing is, right, then you'll just be there with it instead of worrying about these other things. And then, of course, like romance and like sex or things like that are also somewhat present here, which like
Yeah.
hopefully you're fully present in that moment as well, because generally if you're not fully present in that moment, it's like not good things. So
Yeah, good point. I mean, the idea of the artful practices, right? You have all like this big insurgent of Zentangles. Do you know what those are? Yeah.
Yes.
So you're like making these doodles and stuff to specifically avoid your anxious thoughts. Like you're
hmm
focusing in on making a square, making a circle, and abstract art to be present, to bring you down and
hmm
focus on your art. So that's a really good point.
I do that a lot with my art too. It's just
Mm.
like doodles, like stuff that like is not meant to turn into anything necessarily, but it's just like a word over and then like dots layered on top of that. So it's just like layers of doodles and then it's just easy and fun and simple.
Yeah, less stress. Who needs stress when you're working in fifth house, like creative
Yeah.
projects? So that's interesting when we're thinking about our workshops too. Like a Zentangle house would be really kind of cool.
Yeah, maybe do that for the
Like
fifth
little
house.
vines coming up or something.
hmm
And then yeah, romance and sex. So hopefully you're present. That's the goal, right? But there's some things that come into play that'll take us out of the moment. And we kind of talked about it a little bit. We brought up sex. Like, where does sex belong? In the fifth house and the eighth house. So we're thinking about Venus here, which I actually put. I usually say all the technical stuff at the beginning of the episode, and I kind of buried it in this episode's notes. But Venus has its joy in the fifth house. And so when we're talking about sex and romance, we're talking about that Venusian, like, bodily attraction versus like a soul spiritual connection. So like lust and passion versus we're just having sex. It's like the one night stand versus a long term relationship, which
Mm-hmm.
those things can obviously intertwine. But when we're talking about fifth house, we're like that new love spark of passion,
Mm-hmm.
or like the excitement and the butterflies you feel for first dates,
The
or
honeymoon phase.
yes, the honeymoon phase is perfect. Yeah, that hot and heavy, steamy, like, this is it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then we're talking about houses, we're talking about people in those houses too. So, the people that we have romantic partnerships or our partners like that can all speak to fifth house people. Then, of course, creativity is a huge part of the fifth house because we're talking about that Venus influence and also the Leo influence because Leo is pretty creative as well. So, where does your personal creativity shine? Are you an artist, a writer, a musician, like all those Venusian self expression things? Like, where does that come to life, or how does that come to life for you? When we're talking about creativity, I also like to look at the Leo side of the fifth house, where it takes a lot of courage and vulnerability to risk putting your like work, your creative pieces out into the world and being able to express that genuine part of yourself because you're opened up to criticism and critiques and stuff like that. So depending on the planets and the sign on your fifth house, you may be more sensitive to things like that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
When we're talking about literal places in life, the places that you creatively express are all going to be fifth house places. The places also, when we're thinking about Venus, where we share our creativity or just share in general, and how we interact with the people we share with, and how they are appreciative or not appreciative of our work
Mm-hmm.
type deal. Those are all encompassed in the fifth house. So, say you have a Leo fifth house and you're like an influence, your following, like your followers, can all show up in the fifth house, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And celebrations, fifth house topic, like how are you to be celebrated or to be shown that appreciation? If I'm thinking about Capricorn or an Aquarius, well, Saturn ruled fifth house. Maybe it's like kind of a quiet, like you just want solitude appreciation. Like one person come up and be like, good job. And that's it. It's really kind of not a big deal, but it's also appreciation. When we go back, think about sex and romance and creativity. The creative aspect of sex is to create a child. Like that's the
Mm-hmm.
the natural conclusion of success. Like there's clearly sex that doesn't happen that way, but when we think about this idea of creativity, the human body is naturally able to create children. So children fall into the fifth house. And going finding joy, this could be your inner child. If you don't have any children, or if you're still a child, something like that. Your inner child that needs to be nourished, or what they want to find joy in type deal, how they are spontaneous, how they are playful, or it could be the children in your life. I don't have any children of my own biologically, but I have my niece now, and so she's my fifth house child. She shows up in my life in the fifth house. Um, and I have fiery fifth house, so she is pretty fiery. She's mostly Aries fire, but she's got some Sag in there too. Or it could be grandchildren, just any child in your life, including your own inner child, will show up in the fifth house. we're also talking about passion projects or hobbies, stuff that you enjoy doing, because this is all where the pleasure element comes into play. What things do you do that make you feel alive? With our chart example later, I have an interesting take on the passion project example, but it's all encompassing the things that you do for entertainment. How do you entertain yourself? How do you entertain others? You could say the fifth house also speaks to your spontaneity in that aspect. Like, how spontaneous are you in actually going after finding pleasure and joy in life? And when you are, or if you are spontaneous, what do you fill that time with? If you have free time on your calendar, what are you likely to do with that time?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of leads into like recreation, leisure time, right? So the time that we feel fun, we're not really fun at work, right? We have to have our off time to feel fun. That's not always the case. Um, but if you think of the word recreation, it's really recreation. And so this idea of that creative force, how are you recreating your time in purposes of entertainment, or how are you recreating this like vital life force that the sun and Leo kind of talk to? How are you recreating that solar life force within you to make sure that you allow time for the things that light you up? So a Leo fifth house may want to go, because Leo is like the entertainer. They might want to go to a play or the movies or the theater, stuff like that. A Sag fifth house may want to book a trip or get out of town. Aquarius fifth house may show up as like playing video games online, like being a streamer.
You know who has an Aquarius with house? My girlfriend who is in fact a video
I was
game
wondering that. I
streamer.
didn't look at their chart.
Ah.
I don't think I have her chart, but I was like, that's maybe.
Mhm.
It's a good recreation, right? It's fun and it's online. And it doesn't have to
Mhm.
be like streaming specifically, although she is a streamer. Just like playing online with friends, I think is a cool idea for an Aqua fifth house. And then Mercury on the fifth house may want to spend time curled up with a book or writing. So, how do you spend your free time? And then some people, for the purposes of enjoyment, like sports, right? Either playing sports or watching sports. So, sports can also be a big topic for the fifth house. And I think it's really interesting to look at the different elements of sports. When you think of like being involved with a sports team, right? Everyone wears the same attire, the same aesthetics. Like, you're always in team colors and the team jersey, and you're like doing the things that the team does. And that seems very like Venusian, like putting on this like mask to go out and enjoy the thing, kind of. So I thought that was cool. And then, of course, the places where sports are played. So we're talking about like the actual arenas, rinks, fields, whatever, can all play in the fifth house. Okay, so the technical sides of the fifth house. The fifth house is where Venus has their joy. So Venus is most comfortable with the vibes of the fifth house and is super happy there. And Venus is a planet of like love and beauty and how we connect with other people, or has influences on how we experience that creative aspect of our life. So if we're thinking about Venus having joy in the fifth house, and also this natural affiliation with the sun and Leo, it's interesting also to look at Venus's synodic cycle, which is a fancy word for the relationship that Venus in the sky and Sun in the sky have together, like their orbiting cycle, kind of. And the Venus synodic cycle is in years of 8, and it lines up really well with some of the fifth house perfection years. The ages specifically where the fifth house perfection year lines up to the Venus synodic year are 16, 40, 64, and 88. So you have this added dose of Venus, especially if you have Venus in the fifth house. It's like double, triple down on this Venusian aspect of your year. And so these ages can really spotlight. We're thinking about the solar energy of spotlighting this Venus planet and what she likes to do. And often, because this Venus is activated so much in these years, you see things come out when these ages are provoked. Like you see different pieces of art during fifth house and Venus synodic cycle years, or people expressing themselves in different ways, or when you think about the idea of Sweet 16, Venus is bringing in that name, just like the name of the year. The year has a name. Not all our years have a name, but Venus is sweet, and so we call it Sweet 16, right? Or 40 and fabulous, or saying 40 is the new blah, blah, blah. It's like recreating this idea of an age making the difference in how it's going to show up in your life. And there was also a Beatles song. Kelly Surtees brought this up when she had a talk about the age of 40. You can find that lecture on her website, I'm sure, kellysastrology.com. But she brought up the Beatles song called When I'm 64. Are you familiar with that song?
Yeah, I used to be really into the Beatles when I was 16, actually. I was probably really into the
Right?
Beatles. And then the Beatles like junior, senior year of high school.
Yeah, my dad loved the Beatles, and so I definitely clung on to that. But I don't remember this song. But basically, it's just a song about like, when I'm 64, are you still going to love me? Is there still going to be romance? Are you still going to reach out
Mhm.
and be tender? Like all those Venusian things. And 64 is this age where we have a fifth house perfection year and an activated Venus because we have this Venus synodic cycle. So I thought it was a really cool look at not only Venus making art, because it's a song, we're making art around this topic, but that age bringing up this idea of, are you still gonna love me? Beginning verse says, when I'm older, losing my hair many years from now, will you still be sending me a Valentine, birthday greetings, bottle of wine? And I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, it's really sweet. So I thought that was a cool example.
Mhm.
Okay, so thinking about those ages when we have the Venus synodic cycle, we're going to now talk about the perfection year. So, annual perfections is an ancient Hellenistic timing technique that Michelle and I both use. And basically, you find your age. You can download our PDF. You can find your age on our little chart and find whichever house is being activated for you that year from birthday to birthday. And then each year, it'll activate one of the 12 houses in your chart. And by that time, hopefully, we'll have an episode for you to dive into some of the topics. But if you want a few cheat sheets, you can go ahead and grab House Magic. It's your grab and go guide to astrology house insights, and it has all the references and keywords that you need to start connecting the dots. The fifth house ages are age 4, 16, 28, 40, 52, 64, 76, and 88, and so on. So, going back to the idea of the sweet 16, right? Like you're thinking about teenage romance and first loves
Mhm.
and discovering yourself. Like, usually, because it lines up with that Venus synodic cycle, a person at 16 is finding the music they like or the aesthetics they like.
Mhm.
There's something that's changing from childhood into this teenage period where you're like, nope, I only listen to the Beatles now. Like, there's something about your Venusian aspect of yourself that's being activated. You might be finding more hobbies to express your creativity, or joining different sports, or liking different musics, or dressing a different way. And then age 40 is just that midlife kind of, okay, I've spent my 20s and 30s either building my career or having children or whatever I've been focused on, and now I need to recreate what I need to focus on. Like, maybe I have been too busy with my family and now we have to find a hobby for myself, or I'm an empty nester now, whatever the case may be. Like, there's some sort of switch in those Venusian aspects of your life where you're trying to find more pleasure.
Mhm.
And then the older years makes me just think about retirement. What do you want to do after you're working? Do we want to go on cruises now? Do we want
Hmm.
to live at the beach?
Now you have
What's
time to do all those creative hobbies that
Yeah,
you put off.
exactly. And then also grandchildren. If you think of that topic of children coming back into play, you're usually hanging out with grandchildren or the kids in your family.
Just to kind of transition into like examples of our own fifth house years. My first perfection year when I was 4 was an important year for me, but maybe not so much fifth house because the major event of that was like I think I had like surgery and I think starting to live with my mom separate from her and my dad because like in my fourth house perfection year they got divorced. But the 16-year one feels like really on point because it was when I first started dating. So like my first boyfriend and I started dating when I was in the 10th grade and we were dating all the way through. So basically, not long after I turned 16, all the way right until around the time I was like 17. And it was also when I became sexually active initially when I was 16. So more fifth house stuff.
It's a
And
very common age if you pull at least the US, like 16, and I think it refers
mhm,
back to that Venus double down
mhm.
type deal where it's not only a Venus synodic cycle year, you also have the
Mhm.
fifth house activated.
Yeah. So I definitely feel like that year really strongly. And even with like in terms of like creativity and hobbies. So I was on the speech and debate team all 4 years of high school, but without a doubt, my sophomore year was like my best year in terms of like how well I did and in terms of the speeches I did. I took a lot of pride in. They were like ones I really liked and I went to state with them. And so I think creatively I was doing really well then too. The last time when I was 28 was actually the year that I graduated with my bachelor's degree. And then, due to again the stuff that happened in my fourth house year, I wasn't able to immediately go to grad school to get my master's degree. I had to take some time off. And I ended up unemployed. I had like kind of a transition to a new career, right? Because I wanted to go straight to grad school to work on like wanting to be a professor, because that's kind of all I did for one whole 12-year cycle of this. But in this in between part of it, I was a social worker, so it was something totally different from what I had been doing before. It was almost like less creative. It was interesting that it was that year because my Jupiter was retrograde in Leo that year, which is my ninth house of like higher education. So it's retrograde. And in the meantime,
Wow.
like I'm doing all this other stuff. And so I feel my creativity was actually, it was almost like felt like it was like put on hold, right? The stuff that I was doing, the stuff I was working towards. So that was kind of like an interesting year, but it wasn't necessarily, I don't know, it's kind of fifth housey, a little bit like less straightforward as I think maybe the 16-year one. And then of course we also moved in together again, like the second time I think that year was when we
Hmm.
moved back in together.
Yeah, wow. Your fifth house is Aries and it's ruled
Hmm.
by Mars in the fourth. So it would bring
Hmm.
in the whole housing situation deal.
Hmm.
And even social work was at life care, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so even that's an assistant living home.
And also too, because I initially started off like there was a weird thing about my job and so I was doing activities and so I
Oh
was
yeah.
responsible. That's right. So it was very fifth house because
Yeah.
it was being creative in a very different way because I was in charge of doing like art projects with the seniors or we'd play bingo or different things like that. So I guess there was like a lot of creative, but it was like different than what I had been doing, right?
Mhm.
So it's interesting that as like Jupiter's going retrograde, this expansion is going retrograde in my like ninth house of higher education. I'm doing this other thing in the
Wow.
fifth house on my fifth house perfection year, which also helped me get a lot of my higher education jobs though,
Hmm.
ultimately. So that's one of the only jobs I leave on my resume that's not like directly related.
Interesting.
So yeah, that's I mean, and us living together. And we have some synastry there in our fifth house because I think we both have like planets in each other's fifth houses, I think.
Yeah. So
So
Aries is my moon and my Mars. So
mhm.
my moon for sure, moon being home and security and safety. and my you pretty much are all Sag. So my fifth house
Yeah.
is Sagittarius. So basically you
So
just feel that completely.
yeah. So I feel like it makes sense too that that would be a year that like you and I would go back to living together, that we would have something like that happen. And also, I think at the time that we were doing collage and tarot and all that kind of stuff, right, was when we were living together the second time. We were doing a lot of creative kinds of things, like starting a lot of creative hobbies that are helping us later. So
Yes, creative hobbies
Mhm.
sparking creative projects.
Yeah.
Cool, I like that. And then also you said when you were 4 you had a surgery?
Yeah, when I was 4, I had surgery and I was also starting to live with my mom downtown.
Just interesting because of Aries and Mars can be like the knife going under the knife type deal.
Mm,
And then like going back to your fourth house where your Mars is, just
mm,
think of like the recovery time. You're like bedridden or at home or whatever when you're recovering from a
hmm.
medical procedure. And I'm like, that's an interesting example though, because it doesn't
Yeah,
like clearly fit, but it still fits.
yeah, yeah, and a
Okay.
severing of the living situation since the Aries
Mm.
is, I mean, so there's a lot going because it is going to be close with like my fourth house because of the Mars being in there. I do tend to do a lot of creative stuff at home. That would be
Mm.
where I do a lot of my stuff. That's creative. Like I sit outside on the patio and I paint and stuff like that. So,
Yeah, that's perfect. My age 4, first, fifth house perfection year. Obviously, you don't remember a whole lot when you're 4, but that was the year that I met who we call my fairy godmother. And basically, she is a super close family friend. She was the age of my dad, but we called her fairy godmother because she's very whimsical and she always brought the fun into our life, like me and my
Hmm.
sister both. She was able to somehow manipulate my dad's strict rules into, hey, just let them be kids. We're not doing any harm. She was the voice of pleasure as a child. No, it's okay. We can do the things we want because I'll just deal with your dad later. Which is also interesting because I have Saturn and Venus conjunct in my fifth house. So there was kind of this constriction around what I felt I was able to have in my leisure time. And so she kind of was just able to come in and be like, no, we're going to the library. No, we're going to do this project and I'll deal with dad and we're going to have fun. We're going to be kids. So that was interesting. But the thing I just thought of also was that was the year my sister was born. And so that's bringing a
Mm,
child into the family.
hmm.
Obviously, not my child, but she was the only child besides me in my life at that time. So
Hmm.
that's interesting. And then 16, yep, same year stuff. That's when I became sexually active for the first time, and there was a lot of attention around my relationship, boy crazy type 16-year-old girl. And my aesthetics did start changing a little bit. I started dressing different and listening to different music. That's probably around the time I got into hip hop and rap, which is probably meh, but it's a different aesthetic than what I had before that. And then age 28 is interesting to think about that year. Like I said, I have Saturn in the fifth house, and then that year specifically with our tarot card system was a hanged man year.
Mm,
And this idea of Saturn repressing my Venus, repressing my fifth house, and like putting
mm,
restrictions around my joy and my pleasure, that year I actually dealt with a lot of mental health issues and I started antidepressants. To
mm,
bring joy back is basically what antidepressants are, right? And then I also separated from my ex husband that summer, so, this idea of seclusion from the partner. And then later, a couple weeks after my fifth house year ended was when we were officially divorced. So over half of that fifth house perfection year, I was separated. I wasn't married, I wasn't
Hmm.
divorced. I was separated from my partner, which was interesting to look back on.
I mean, it's interesting too, because like with what I was just saying about that year and Jupiter being retrograde in Leo, like you as a Leo
Yes,
rising, like having that going on. And so it shows how it's going to be different, right? Jupiter's going to be retrograde in Leo for all of us that year, right? But like where it's showing up in our chart is going to have a really big difference on what specifically is going on for us that year, and then how it might relate back to the stuff that's going on in our perfection house. So,
exactly. And with this Venus retrograde in Leo, my natal sun is in my seventh house. And so it's like doubling down on that partnership aspect of though this is going to play out in your committed relationships. Yeah. So going back to that, fifth house isn't always rainbows and butterflies. It depends on what's being activated, what planets you have there, if they're
mhm.
happy, what sign is there. But just this, the hanged man year kind of caught me off guard because I'm in my hanged man year now. And before this year started, I looked back and I think that was my last hanged man year. And I was like, cool, I got a divorce and all this stuff happened. like, but it's playing out very differently this time around. Okay, so yes, any planets and signs on or in the fifth house will kind of flavor how you experience all these themes, what's going to show up for you, what's being activated. Another cool, it wasn't a perfection thing, but just the planets in my fifth house. So I have Venus, Uranus, and Saturn. Depending on your orbs, they're all pretty close. to get not to get technical, they're all in there. But I just thought about this idea that in high school I used to write a lot of poetry, so I used to use my Venus a lot, and it was all like spur of the moment. If you think about Uranus and Venus working together, it was nope, I'm writing right now and then I'm done. Like it wasn't I'm writing this poem and then I'm editing it 5 times and then I'm okay with it. It was like I'm just getting this all out right now. I'd write like sometimes 2 or 3 poems in a class period, which is I was a good student, so I still had good grades while I did this. But one interesting thing is there was always this time element that would show up in my poetry, and Saturn deals a lot with time. And then if it wasn't time, I'd be like thinking of different alternate worlds. Oh, if I wasn't in
Mm,
class right now, blah, 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 blah. And so that would show up in my poetry also, which is
mm.
kind of like Sagittarius y. And then my best friend, he would copy off my notes and stuff. But not only was I taking my notes, I was writing poetry. So at the end of the class, I'd usually give away. I'd either write a note to my other friends and send them in the hallway or whatever. But with Kevin, I'd write and I'd give it to him. And sometimes he would take those and create melodies because he played acoustic guitar. And he would write songs based on my poetry, use my poems as lyrics.
Hmm.
And that aspect is really interesting to think about because my fifth house is Sagittarius, so ruled by Jupiter, and Jupiter is in the eighth house of shared
Hmm.
resources, and also Pisces. And Pisces seems like very whimsical and soulful and able to just put it into song format.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, yeah, just some examples of planets within the house and how they can show up. Also, I feel like, I mean, most artists, most Venusian people get their best work when they're depressed and going through hard times, right? But my Saturn Venus there, I feel like I definitely write more when I am sad or going through
Hmm.
something.
I mean, I also feel like
Yeah.
I tend to be more like I also like mine, the only planet I have in my fifth house is I have my north node. Like the only like
mm.
placement really that I have and there is my north node is in my Aries fifth house. I always think of the north as the thing I'm like trying to do or the thing that I'm most motivated to do or want to do or something. So I tend to always like to do creative stuff.
A few more examples when we're talking about fifth house being involved with Aries and Mars. You could have a creative approach or a romantic approach that's like bold and energetic or passionate. You might enjoy physical activities like sports or things where you can compete more of a competitive edge, which I know you can have.
Yeah, I'm not super into sports, watching or playing them, but I am very competitive about whatever things I do enjoy. I like to be the best at the thing. I have a lot of trouble, right, with even just hobbies, right, where I'll start a hobby and I'm like, oh, this seems like fun. But if I'm not immediately picking it up, like where I think that I can
Mm.
do this hobby to perfection, then I probably won't keep doing it. Whatever I do, I've got to be the best at it.
That's funny. Aries wants that like cardinal beginner's luck.
Mhm.
Taurus in the fifth house could add just like an extra layer of Venus, and you can find pleasure in the simple or the finer things in life, like art, music, stuff like that, or just enjoying decadent meals and things that bring comfort and beauty, more of that sensual Taurian energy. Gemini or Mercury on the fifth house can enjoy mental stimulation. So there could be the ones going out and talking to people. Hobbies might include like writing and reading and lively conversations. Okay, before we jump into our chart example today, we would like to invite you to join the Artful Houses series. If you're enjoying these house topics, we will pick them up in a artful workshop, very fifth house.
Hmm.
Instead of spending a ton of time researching, you can just listen to our podcast and come to
Hmm.
our workshops. We're going to share more about the house that we're talking about for the month and look at your chart specifically. So everything's personalized. We'll talk about what sign you have on the house, what planets you have in the house, and what that all can mean for you. And then give you some creative prompts, and then we'll work through an art project together to create a beautiful manifestation of your house in a visual format.
Hmm.
So if you'd like to join us for that, the wait list is in the links below for the Artful Houses series, and we would love to create with you. All right, so our chart example today is Dolly Parton. She is, if you do not know, an American country singer, songwriter, actress. She kind of came out in the 70s, but since then has been creating a little Dolly Parton empire. She has a Virgo ascendant with moon in the first house. And then her fifth house is Capricorn, where she has Mercury, Venus, and the Sun. And just like I think our last chart example, we know that Mercury is extra elevated and important because it rules her ascendant. So it's her chart
Mm.
ruler. So
Oh,
just,
and Gemini is her 10th house, so another
yes,
Mercury.
yeah, public reputation and career, what she's known for. So
Hmm.
she's definitely known for her creativity and songwriting. Writing is Mercury and songs Venus for sure. With Sun in the fifth house, she has a life mission or a central lesson in life to show her true self expression, that creativity we're talking about in the fifth house. And also, we have Venus in the fifth house. And like we said, Venus has that joy, that happy place in the fifth house. She has actually written over 3,000 songs. So she's
That's wild.
really, right? That's so much. I, yeah. I mean, she's been around for a while, but even then, that's a lot. So we have that Mercurial and Venus definitely being activated there. And another example of Mercury in the fifth can just be this idea of creative thoughts or creative thinking. So if anyone has a Mercury in the fifth, that could be another example. But all of that being said, we also have a heavy Saturn presence because we're looking at the sign of Capricorn, right? So, Capricorn in the fifth house can show up as her using her creative powers to form that solid, long lasting legacy that she's doing, which she has been on a mission for forever now. And then going back to that idea of how are you likely to be celebrated or appreciated or shown appreciation in the fifth house, I think Capricorn there is likely you're just celebrated for your super hard work and your chosen profession. And Michelle pointed out Mercury's also talking about the 10th house, so celebrated on what you're putting out in the world. Talking about that Saturn presence with Capricorn on the house, her first solo hit was for the song Joshua in 1971. And this is a really interesting look at a Venus Saturn. Because, like, for me, I have the planets in the fifth house, but for her, it's Venus in a Saturn ruled sign.
Mm.
So, this song, Joshua, is about a man who's basically living as a hermit, which a hermit is very Saturnian. And he's living down like these down the railroad tracks, and part of the lyrics describe him as folks says he's a mean and vicious man and better not set foot on his land. So that seems like a Saturnian Capricorn type figure, you know?
Hmm.
He has the boundaries up of like, stay off my lawn. And so in the song, she hears about all these rumors about this guy living down the railroad tracks from townsfolk, but decides to go down there and meet him herself and see if it's true. So she is using her Venus to go connect with the person. And the song describes him as his beard and his hair were long and black, and he was the biggest man I'd ever seen. When he spoke, his voice was low and deep, but he just didn't frighten me. And Saturn speaks a lot about fears, but with Venus there, Venus is going to kind of lighten Saturn's load. Not a whole lot, because Saturn's more of a heavy hitter than Venus, because it's a slower planet, so it has more staying power, basically. But when Venus comes along, it can give it just like a little bit, like my fairy godmother. We're not harming anyone, we're just having a little fun, like lighten up, right? So she's not afraid of this guy, even though everyone in the town's told her to be. She uses her Venus to come over and say, nah, it's not that big of a deal. I'm going to go connect with him. And then later on in the song, they end up falling in love. Like they spend the whole night together, whatever, and they talk forever, which is also interesting. They spent the whole night talking, which is
Mm.
that Mercury, right? That Mercury and Venus, really, talking and connecting. And she ends up falling for this guy, and the lyrics go, Joshua, Joshua, why you're just what I'm looking for. Joshua, Joshua, you ain't gonna be lonesome no more. So basically, she just stays with him and falls in love, and then they're just happily ever after. So I just thought that was really like a cool take on this creativity with the Saturn Venus
Hmm.
influence. And the song that put her on the map almost. Put her in the spotlight. Ooh, there we go. Okay, so we talked a little about the fifth house being the house of entertainment. Like, where do you find entertainment? But if you're somebody like Dolly and you are the entertainment, you're in the entertainment business, the fifth house can then speak about your stage presence and how you feel in the limelight or the way you show up when you're in the limelight. So with Saturn there, like we talked about this fear, she didn't fear Joshua down on the tracks, but she did have Saturnian fear in real life, even though she's this huge country star at this point. She was not an exception to stage fright when it came to singing the national anthem at the Super Bowl. She was quoted, I was offered many times, but I've never accepted. I've been scared to death to sing that. And it's like you have this super successful career of singing and you are still scared of singing. But she cited the potential criticism, which we kind of talked about, that vulnerability can lead to criticism, and then that Saturn influence of like harshness, coldness, maybe. She was quoted, that is such a hard song to sing, and people are so critical if you really mess up bad. I've just always been afraid of it. You always want to be great, especially something that serious. So it's like talking about that cold sobering up of Saturn there and just not,
Mhm.
I'm afraid to do, I can't do this justice, whatever. So at 16, we talked about 16 being that pivotal Venus point, fifth house
Mhm.
perfection year. At 16, her and her uncle actually got signed to what ended up being her first record labels. There was one called Tree Publishing and another one called Mercury Records in Nashville. And I'm
Hmm.
like, with her Mercury in the fifth
Mhm.
house, I'm like, that is wicked cool. And she's a like I said, that Mercury is super important for her because it's her chart ruler and the ruler of her 10th house public career. So I'm like, yes, I'm signing up for Mercury Records. On those two labels, she ended up recording her first single on a major label, and it didn't do very well. And so she actually got dropped from both labels, I think, later that year, which is also interesting thinking about this Saturn influence, putting the restrictions like, oh, we don't really like your song, we don't need you anymore. But also, Saturn in Cancer, I don't think Saturn's very happy in Cancer because it's across from its home sign of Capricorn. So it can have some difficulties, but it's also conjunct Mars, which is like that cutting away that she's got both traditionally malefic planets in the 11th house playing a role in the 5th house. 1974, her next 5th house perfection year, she's 28. She had three more number one hit songs, including Love is Like a Butterfly and I Will Always Love You, which I Will Always Love You was super famous thanks to Whitney Houston and other people who
Mhm.
remade it. But the other one specifically for Jolene, and that reached number one in the country charts and made it top 100. I think it was number 60 in the pop charts.
Mhm.
And we think, I didn't write this down also, but like when we think about Jolene, that's about a love relationship
Mhm.
and a stressful Saturn relationship. So that's really interesting too.
Mhm.
The fear around losing your partner to another person.
Yeah.
80. So she had a lot of really interesting things happen in 1980 specifically, and I was trying to find why that is. I didn't look at any transits or anything, but it was an 11th house year for her, which would have been activating that Saturn that rules the 5th house. So it's still 5th house related. But she was recreating how she was using her career of entertainment, and she came out with her first film. She
Mhm.
released 9 to 5 and ended up being a super hit when she crossed over with that song into the pop charts. And it was also interesting just thinking about Capricorn there being about work and stuff, and that it was called 9 to 5.
Mhm.
And she ended up winning a bunch of awards. So that Venus in Capricorn, she won Golden Globe nomination for Best Supporting Actress, Best New Film Star, and Best Original Song for the title song, as well as People's Choice Award for Favorite Music Song, which was 9 to 5, and the Oscar nomination for the title winning song. So it really highlighted that Sun, Venus, putting her
Mhm.
in the spotlight for her musical abilities and also her able to shapeshift and work in that film industry as well.
Mhm.
And so then age 40. So 40 is another one of those Venus synodic cycles and fifth house perfection years. So going back to that idea of those passion projects, she in 1986 at the age of 40 built Dollywood, which is a theme park, a amusement park in Tennessee after just her whole brand basically.
Mhm.
And I think this is a cool idea of reimagining the passion project instead of coming out
Mhm.
with a particular new album or something. It's like, nah, I'm gonna make
Yeah.
a theme park. So she opened, it was like a $75 million theme park and was quoted, "The park is enthusiastically and unashamedly tacky." The fifth house can talk about how we express our uniqueness and how with Venus there, our aesthetics might not always be what the people want, but
Mhm.
this blend of Capricornian business because it's starting a whole new business venture, owning a theme park,
Mhm.
and the fifth house of expression. It's all like her brand, her face, her aesthetics. And then that Venusian element of play, like it's an amusement park.
Mhm.
And then by 1993, Dollywood was racking in $30 million annually, adding to her continued legacy with that Capricorn influence there and the 10th house correlation, and the fact that Venus in her fifth house rules her second house of income, which also has Jupiter there. So she's getting a lot of income from this creative
Mhm.
side project, $75 million side project.
And her Saturn, it's in the 11th house, right? So it's like groups of people. So
Ooh,
that's like,
fan bases.
yeah. And theme parks is like lots of people, like groups of people and stuff like that. So, and it's Cancer, I always think of as like home, right? So this is, it's kind of a theme park of like her and her home and all of that, like lots of people coming in.
Yeah, and it's in her home state, so it's like
Hmm.
close to I don't I don't know how close it is, but I don't know Tennessee. But yeah, this idea of home for sure with Cancer. I like that. And then just a few more quick notes. I mean, they're not really super noteworthy, but I saw a cool connection between Capricorn and Mercury here. She wrote an autobiography called Dolly, My Life and Other Unfinished Business. And I'm like, business writing. I
Hmm.
like that. And then also a quote. She was quoted, "I'm always tickled to death when country music is given the respect that I really think it deserves. And country music is so hot right now." So I think this quote is all encompassing of the fifth house because tickled, you usually think tickle is like a fun, playful thing, right? But when you're
Hmm.
being tickled to death, we have mortality come into play, then Saturn's there, and Saturn's, nah, this is torture. It's not fun. And then when she talks about country music given the respect, I think that's that Capricorn aspect. It's ambitious and wants that respect for the hard work and stuff. So I think respect and integrity and stuff like that are very Capricornian language.
Mm.
And then just saying that I don't know what year she was quoted for this, so I don't know what songs were on the chart tops, but like saying country music is so hot right now just seems like an opinion you would have about your own aesthetics. So I think that's calling in her Venus. Like, not everyone's going to say country music's so hot right now because there's people out there that don't like country music. But like, it's calling on your own Mercury opinions and your Venus aesthetics to make this assumption. I think
Hmm.
tickled to death and country music is so hot right now, I think is really cool way to sum up her fifth house expression.
Hmm.
Stop sharing. Unless you have anything else to add there.
I do not.
Okay.
I
Um any final thoughts about the fifth house?
don't know. I'm interested in the fifth house. Like I feel like it's one again that like I'm like I don't have as much like going on there, and Aries is not a sign that I'm particularly connected to or drawn to or something. And so like it's interesting because I feel like fifth house topics are really interesting to me, but I feel like I know less about the fifth house. It would be helpful to delve in more
Yeah.
after to think more about it. Because I feel like it's a really important part of life. I feel like it's one of the parts of life almost that we don't get enough of, especially now, right? That there's not
Mhm.
a lot of time for like we talk a lot about how those third places aren't really there anymore. So like a lot of millennials, they're like, oh, like it's hard to like date in person or it's hard to meet people or have friends because there's not like a
Oh,
place to
right.
go after work, right? That like third place, it's like you have work and you have home, and then it's like, where else do you go? Especially if you're not necessarily interested in going to bars or like you don't attend church, there's not like a lot of places to be creative and meet other people and have those kinds of interactions and stuff. And I think that's a lot of what's missing from life now. We have a lot of people who are burnt out and just working and surviving and stuff like that. So I feel like it's an important place to look for if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling burnt out, like maybe one of the places to go back to is the fifth house. What are the things that like really bring you that kind of like joy and that feeling of like creativity and stuff?
Yeah, really good point. It is societally ignored or easily pushed aside when we have so many other things to do. And now it's harder to find recreation that doesn't cost a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Like going to the movies is now like a $50 feat for two people,
Mm-hmm.
if not more. Yeah, so that's a super good point. And then I was just thinking about Aries for you because I'm like, you're right. You're a somewhat fiery person, but you're more like an intellectually fiery person. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know how to really like, that's not really what I what is encompassing what I'm thinking about, but not necessarily an Aries fiery person, but you did do kickboxing for a while. And
It's
I
true.
know it was really fun for me too. But like one of the reasons you stopped was because you're getting a little too competitive with yourself. Like you wanted to see
Mm-hmm.
the results. Like it was more of like a weight like an exercise routine versus a pleasure
Yeah.
play routine.
I mean, I basically pushed myself so hard that I had to stop working out entirely for a while because I started just having like dizzy spells whenever I'd be working
Mm.
out after doing it for months and stuff. So, yeah. Do you enjoy physical activity and things like that? It's not that I don't like
Yeah,
not at
yeah.
all like any of those things. But like, when it comes to doing what I want to do, I do only want to do what I want to do. I have
Mm.
stuff that I go, this is the thing I'm interested in at this moment. And this is the only thing that I'm interested in doing right now. And this is what I want to do. And I get kind of annoyed if I have to be taken away from the thing that I'm like
Mm.
interested in doing. And so it's definitely very like motivated, like internally motivated, which I feel like is that North Node part of it that I'm going towards what I want. Like I'm going towards what I desire or what feels good to me, like creatively, which if you're into human design, like a generator kind of thing, right? I only like to do the thing that like lights me up or brings me joy or like whatever, right? So, and I feel like that kind of is that they're very like in that way, like kind of like cardinal, like pushing
Hmm.
forward. And it's not selfish exactly, but a sign that's kind of like the self. This is what I want. So,
Yeah, Aries can be single minded. They kind of have blinders on. They're like on this mission to do the one
hmm
thing that they're. Yeah, so that makes sense. Or just the cardinality factor of starting things. Maybe you just get excited with that beginner's luck idea that things start and then okay, I'm bored with this, I'm going to move on to something else to start, and it's not
hmm
necessarily the thing that you're doing that brings you enjoyment. It's just like starting new things and like trying things
hmm
out that would bring the pleasure for you.
hmm
And I was also thinking about like um we both kind of at different points in our I was like 15, but we both at different points in our life have been drawn to archery.
hmm
And I like archery for you because obviously this sad name of the archer and stuff. But
hmm
if you think of it in a fifth house Aries way, archery, bow and arrow is a weapon. And that seems kind of Aries. I don't know.
hmm Yeah. Yeah. I, it's interesting. Like I feel like I'll have to think about it somewhere because it's not really one that I've focused on a lot.
Okay, cool. I think we're good then. All right. So look at your fifth house. Use the house
hmm
magic PDFs to find the rulers of your house to blend in wherever your ruler is to what's going on with your creativity and your joy,
hmm
and try to find more pleasure in life. Look at
Yeah.
your fifth house and see what that can equate to in your daily life and go after it because we do. We need more
Yeah.
of those.
I need more
Those
joy.
more joy. Lots more joy. Alrighty. Until next week, we'll talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.